Hi, in this sidewalk video, we'll be looking at the basic workflow and concepts for working with cloth physics in Unreal Engine 5. Uh, so cloth physics in Unreal Engine 5 is very nice to have because it reacts dynamically in real time. So it's very good for, this very natural changes and movement of the cloth, reacting to position, rotation, direction of your movement, and even other factors like wind actors. Um, so it's very nice to have to add that little bit of extra quality and natural animation to things that are soft and fluttery. So in lower spec machines, you could kind of get away with cloth animation by keyframing bones, but that what that leads to is a repetitive and looping animation. So you may not want to have too much of that, even though it's very efficient for performance, especially when you have a lot of the same animation playing at the same time. You're gonna start noticing that pattern happening very quickly. So having these cloth physics will add something that looks more natural, right, within the scene. So let's begin with a simple demonstration to explain the workflow, and then I will go into a breakdown of the concepts on and how to do it. Okay. All right, so that ends the demo. And now we'll go into a breakdown of the steps taken to set this up. Right, so as you can see from the demo, the workflow is very simple, but there are a couple of very important concepts to understand before really be able to grasp how to work with cloth in Unreal 5. Okay. The first important concept is that this cloth physics, right, only works with skeletal meshes in Unreal 5. This means that it has to be a mesh that is rigged to a bone. And so having a bone is important, right? Is necessary for this workflow. And the number of bones and the position of bones will have an influence on the final effect. For this simple demo, when you're trying to get started, right, a single bone is simple enough. So all you have to do is just go to a software like Blender and create your cloth mesh, and make sure that you have enough faces and vertices on your cloth to get a nice effect on it. Right, the less polygons that you have, then the less natural the cloth is going to look. Then what I've done here is that I've placed a single bone at the top of the cloth over here. So once again, as I mentioned, the position of the cloth, the position of the bone matters a lot, right? And this has to do with the way the cloth physics works, which I'll explain in a minute. So after skinning the bone to the cloth mesh, right, exported this as FBX file and then imported it into Unreal. Then the next step after that is just to open up your skeletal mesh, and then excuse me, let me just stop this here. Okay. Right. And I'm just going to redo some of the steps, right? So I removed the clothing data. So once you've opened up your skeletal mesh, right, and you're in this view over here, the next step is just to select the cloth, right? You can see it being highlighted in yellow here, right? And then you just have to right click and create clothing data from section. Now, what they mean by section here is the part of the mesh that's using a particular material. So the next important concept that you have to understand about cloth physics is that it is applied to a particular material. So if you have a character mesh, right, a human body with a scarf, right, and you only want that scarf to have the cloth physics, then that cloth has to be assigned a different material from the rest of the body. So the rest of the body doesn't have cloth physics, only that other cloth, only the scarf with the other material will have the cloth physics. And then so that is basically a different section, right, of this mesh. So so we roll back a little bit, right? We select the cloth mesh, we right click, and then we create clothing data. Then over here you can give your clothing data a unique name, right? Or you can just use the default name that is assigned for you. Then after that you click create, right? And after that is done, clothing data information has been created. You won't see anything happen right away. You can see in the asset details over here that something has been created for you under clothing, right? So under the array elements, it will go from 0 array elements to 1. And when you expand this, you'll be able to see your clothing data that you just created over here. But this clothing data exists over here, but it hasn't been assigned to the mesh yet. It's just been created from the section. So what the clothing data does is that you can actually expand this and go in there and define the properties of the cloth. Now, the properties of the cloth is quite complex, and a good starting point to understanding what parameters to change and how to change it would be to go to Unreal 5's content samples, right? So if you go under content samples project and you look under the cloth map, you'll be able to get these settings over here. right? As you can see, and you might see something like this, right? Inside the content samples, right? So this will show you all the different settings that they use to achieve this effect for the cloth, right? So starting with burlap as a starting point, you just have to enter these values into the clothing data to get kind of like a good starting point to all of this. Then if you want something softer, then you can try these values over here. If you want something more heavy and thick that doesn't deform as much, then you could try something like these settings over here. So, you know, what might be also good to try, right, is perhaps these values over here highlighted in yellow, right? When you're trying to go softer or harder, right, you could try playing with these values first before adjusting the others. Now, so you can have all these settings set up, right? Then the next step is to apply this cloth data to the mesh that you created. So after you have created the clothing data, you can right click on the mesh again and then apply the clothing data to the mesh. But right off, when you're just kind of starting out, you won't see this effect happen right away because in fact, you probably won't see anything happen at all. And what you have to do is you go into the activate cloth paint mode over here, right? So the next part of this workflow is that after you apply the clothing data, you activate the cloth paint mode, then you select the clothing data that was assigned to this mesh. Then after that, you scroll down and you start painting parts of the mesh. So what you're actually painting here is you're just trying to tell Unreal which parts of the cloth will have zero influence, and then which parts of the cloth will have more clothing data influence. But that's not the full story, right? So what you're seeing here is that the pink areas, the pink and black areas, basically have no influence at all. So that's why when we activate the cloth, you can see that the cloth there stays at those points. So any place that you want to kind of like pin down, you want it to be in that pink color. Okay. For the rest of it, you will get a gradient, right, of something like black to white. But this is so as I mentioned before, right, the position of your bone matters. And the reason why it matters is because when you start painting the values onto the cloth, right, like this setting over here, paint value, this is not a 0 to 100% kind of value. It is more like a distance from the bone kind of value. So by putting 100 over here, you're trying to say that this vertex is allowed to move 100 centimeters away from the bone. So so that's why it can be a little bit confusing, right? A little bit misleading when you look at this. But regardless, right, what you should do here as part of your workflow is that you decide which tool you want to use, whether you want to use a brush tool, a gradient tool, or a fill tool to begin with. Then after that, you will set the paint value, okay, that you want to, you know, put onto the vertex. You can adjust the brush settings, right? Then after that, you get to painting. So when you first start out, okay, perhaps the paint value will look something like this. Okay. Right, so the default setting will probably look something like this. So this means that you know, there is no clothing data being applied onto these vertices. So you might start out with something like fill, or you might start out with something like gradient to put a kind of blanket value on everything. So fill will kind of put a single value on everything. So you might put something like 100 or 150. So how do you decide what fill value you want? So for this, you need to understand roughly how large what are the dimensions of your cloth. So in Blender, right, when we created this plane, the default size is 2 meters by 2 meters. So a good starting point will be the size of the cloth, like something like 200. Okay, and then when you put in this value, you can come over here and just do a left click, and they will fill everything with that 200 value on all the vertices. Okay, then the next step is to pin the cloth, according to your needs. If you wanted a flag, then maybe you want to pin an entire edge, right, or a banner, right? So you might pin an entire edge. Or in my case, I just want to pin the corners. So I will go to brush and then change my pin value to 0, right? And then I will change the radius size, strength, and fall off. So fall off controls the kind of fade away radius, okay, over there. But if you just want a hard value, you can just set this to 0, okay, and then just kind of do a click on either side over here, okay, right. So once this is done, you can just deactivate the cloth paint mode, and then you can see the results of the cloth physics already, right? So just to show some of the other features, right? You can try. Let's do a fill again, okay? Like so. Okay. And then let's try gradient. Now, gradient mode is very useful as well, especially for long strips of cloth. But there are some steps that are not immediately obvious, okay, to the user. So I explained that in this video. So the first step for gradient is you need to decide on the start and the end value. So I may start with something like a value of 50, and then I might end with a value of, say, 250. So it's okay to go beyond the dimensions of your cloth size, especially if you want it to flutter, a lot, right? Okay. So I'm just going to go with 50 and 250. So the next step is to sort of go over the vertices, right? So I'm going to start from this edge, and then I want the gradient to end at this edge, right? So I go left click and I click over the vertices over here, right? So I haven't discovered a way to undo my mistakes. So if you make a mistake doing this, you just have to deactivate the cloth pane and then come back again and restart the process. So so I highlight this starting edge over here first, and then for my end value, I will have to hold Control and then do the same for the line of vertices down here. Okay, right. Okay. So other thing to note about this paint mode, right, is that once you start clicking onto the mesh, they disable the camera movement mode, right? So you may not be able to pan your camera right away. You have to kind of right click twice before you can gain control of your camera again, right? So this is the setup that I'm trying to go for. I'm trying to create a gradient from top to bottom. So I start by left clicking the top row, and then I control click the bottom row. And then the final step, right, again, it's not obvious, right? They don't have a button for this, is to hit the enter button, right? So if you hit the enter button, you will confirm the gradient, and then you'll start to apply the values, right? So there you have it. Okay, you see some slightly darker gray up here and a brighter color down here. Okay. Let's see if we can change the view mode here, okay, so that you can better visualize the gradient. Okay, so this is a more accurate representation of what we've just created, right? If you match the view to these values over here. Okay, so if I'm happy with this, I will deactivate it, and then you see the cloth kind of drop and stretch, beyond its original dimensions. Okay, so we don't really want this. We want to kind of lock the top over here. So we'll go back to brush and set our paint values. Okay, maybe go with a smaller size over here. Okay, and then just quickly paint in the 0 value, right, to the top edge. Okay, just do a rough one. and then deactivate. Okay, and yep, right. Okay, so to visualize this, we can then just head out to the editor, right? But this essentially is the workflow for uh, working with cloth physics in Unreal, right? Okay, so let's just close this out. Okay, and we come over here. Right, so the other thing that I kind of did in the demonstration is that I added a wind directional source, and you can get this from the place actors panel. And if you activate this and you type in wind, you can get the wind directional source. Dragging this into your viewport here, you can play around with the settings over here, right? Like strength and speed. Like, so I put 10 and 1, and let's simulate, right? Okay, and this is what we get. If you don't really see the movement, you can increase the wind source over here. Okay, like so. So during the demo, there was at one point you have seen that the cloth kind of didn't flutter like this, and it kind of got stuck halfway, you know, around here at this edge. And that was because that of the values that I painted onto the cloth, right, wasn't sufficient. It was too short. So I started with 150. So when I changed it to 200, I got a much more natural looking flutter at the end, right? Okay. But it wouldn't really matter too much if your wind speed wasn't very strong, and you know the cloth only kind of swayed around at this level. Okay. Right. Okay. Right. So once again, I want to highlight that that distance that we painted, right, into the cloth, okay, right, that we painted over here using gradient, right, 250, right, okay, is a distance that we set from the bone distance, right? So this is a very important point to note. Okay, so knowing that this is the basic workflow, I would advise you to kind of practice this workflow a little bit, right, before attempting something more complex, like working with a character mesh, for example, right? Okay, just wanna move this around a little bit more, just to show the effects of it. Right, so you might see some issues over here, and maybe the distance is not enough. Let's try cranking up. Okay, so it looks quite alright. Okay, right. So that's the gist of it. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the concepts before moving on to something a little bit more complex. I mentioned earlier that the important concepts of such as section, right? And material IDs. So I'd like to kind of elaborate more on that by creating a cube over here. Okay. Right. So what we have here is a simple cube, and if you were to assign a material to this cube, like so, okay, let's give it a base color. Okay. Right. You'll see that the material is applied evenly across all its surfaces. Okay. But it is possible, even though this is a single mesh, for you to assign different materials to different faces of the mesh. Okay. So to do this in Blender, right, you can just increase the material slots like so, right, and then give it new materials, okay, like so, right, and maybe you might give it different colors. Okay, right, but you can see that all the surfaces are still green color. Okay, so now we're going to go into edit mode, and select individual faces. For example, like this. Okay, and then to assign a different material, you just have to select the material, select the faces, and then click assign. Okay, assign, select, and assign. Right, so you can see now these two faces have been assigned a different material. And then I'm just gonna do that again for these faces over here. Right, that's it. Okay. So it's a single mesh with 3 materials assigned to it. We're going to export this now. Okay, I'm gonna select objects, multi-material cube, and export this. Then bring this into Unreal. Okay, so right, and before that, maybe I want to turn it into a skeletal mesh as well, right? So as to demonstrate this. Okay, so I'm just gonna create armature, single bone, and parent this. Okay, and just export this again. Okay, and finally bring this in. Okay, there you go. Oh, wait, this is another one that I've done earlier. Let's see. No matter, right? Just demonstrate this with this one. Okay, so you can see that over here, this is skeletal mesh, right? It has a single bone on it, and when you select its various faces, okay, it selects different sections, okay, of it. So this is what I mean by when you have a character mesh later on, right? Make sure that the parts that you want to have cloth effects on, to assign a different material to it, so that the that cloth section can be selected individually in this panel. Then that way you can create the uh, cloth data, right, on that section only, right? So you can call this the red cloth, right, and create this just for that section. Okay, and then when you apply it, okay, you can do so like that. Okay. Right, so that's the basic workflow. Right, there it is. Okay. Right, so let's move on to something a little bit more advanced, right? And for example, a character model might be good. Okay, so what I have here is a bipedal character model, right, already rigged with bones. And what I've done is that I've created 2 strings of bones over here for these 2 strips of cloth. Just to illustrate what the differences are, right? Some people may prefer to create this skeletal mesh this way, right, with the bones kind of sticking out like this. And I just want to show what's the difference between doing it this way and just doing it kind of straight down. So imagine if you're doing some kind of a cape or a scarf, right? Do you want the cape to be laid out in this fashion or kind of straight down, right? And what's the difference? So if you export this model over to Unreal, okay, right, you will get something like this. Okay. And just to put it into the scene for the to show you, right? This is what we have. We have the red cloth and the green cloth. We simulate it. Okay. Then what you're gonna see, okay, is the red cloth that I've painted. Okay. doesn't fall all the way down to the bottom over here, right? And if you remember what we discussed earlier, right, that the settings that you paint into the cloth is distance from the bones, okay? That is the reason why this is kind of happening right now, right? Because not enough distance have been painted to the end here, so it doesn't want to fall all the way to the end. So in this case, this green setup, right, is actually better, okay? Because if you were moving around, it doesn't really matter so much. Okay, but if the character were to come to a complete stop, you might see some problems like this in its resting position. And of course, if you had persistent kind of wind source in the scene, again, maybe it's not such a big problem, right? Because the cloth will be fluttering anyway. Okay. But in the scenario where it's completely still, okay, you may not want this kind of a look. Okay. Right. And once again, okay, the basic workflow, right, for something like this. Okay, let me just remove the clothing data, like that. Okay, so once you bring it into Unreal, if you had assigned a different material to the scarf, then you'll be able to select these strips of cloth individually, and then you can just right click and create the clothing data for it, and give it a name that you can identify easily, right, like cloth red. Okay, then after that, apply it, and then go into activate cloth paint, select your cloth red, okay, and then select your painting tool, and set it a desired value for it, and just paint away. Okay, remember to leave a little bit so that the cloth stays attached to the character. Okay, so you can see now that I've applied enough distance, and then it will kind of drop naturally to the ground. Okay. Right. So this kind of cloth physics can really enhance your character model, and would be very useful for adding a little bit more of a natural motion to the cloth. You may be able to keyframe animations to the bones to animate the cloth, but a hybrid method might actually might give you the best results. Because the keyframe animations will not sway when you turn and rotate the character dynamically, and the cloth physics will give you that. The cloth physics will also be able to do things like enhance things like hair mesh, hair cards, and so on and so forth, right? For things like perhaps pouches and canisters that hang off the belt, that you will probably need a different setup to create that effect. Things like hinge effects, right? So that's not really cloth physics. Cloth physics is more for soft bodies, plain like meshes, okay, like this. Right. So I hope this helps, and do catch the other videos that I'll be creating uh, later on, right? To kind of build on top of this knowledge that we've just demonstrated over here. Cool. Right. Thanks.